The house that Pac-Man built steps into the ring with Sony as the PlayStation celebration continues. Hey folks, I'm Joe, this is Same Name, Different Game, and welcome back to the PlayStation Celebration. Last time we talked about what is arguably the most important first-party game of the PlayStation's first year, and now we're going to shift gears and talk about Sony's third-party relationships, and specifically what is most likely the most important third-party relationship they had in the early goings, with Namco. So let's get started with a little history. I've gone over the early history of Namco way back when I talked about Ms. Pac-Man on the NES, but suffice it to say they have a long and storied history in arcades, including a little game you might have heard of. You know, since it's only the single most successful arcade cabinet in history, Pac-Man. The company was started by Masaya Nakamura in the 50s, going through a few different names until landing on Nakamura Amusement Machine Manufacturing Company, which was then shortened to Namco. The list of heavy hitters from Namco is too lengthy to mention, but they were prolific, and as the curtain raised on the post-Street Fighter II 90s arcade boom, they were ready to hit game centers with cutting-edge 3D games to rival Sega. And to do it, they would eventually turn to Sony. Their first in-house attempt at 3D hardware was the System 21 board, for which work began in 1985. It didn't bear fruit until 1988 in Japan, and 89 everywhere else with Winning Run, a Formula One style racing game. The board was kept in service for some time though, until the mid-90s, and included games like a Galaxian sequel no one seems to remember. Their next attempt would be one many remember though, the creatively named System 22 board, whose first wide release would be Ridge Racer. The problem was that the System 22 board was made mostly for big deluxe cabinets, due primarily to the cost of producing the board itself, so post Ridge Racer it continued to be used not only for driving games like, well, the Ridge Racer sequels, but also shooting games like Time Crisis, and one of my personal arcade favorites, skiing game Alpine Racer. But what Namco really needed was something more cost-effective that could be justifiably put into smaller, less gimmicky arcade cabinets for cheap. Enter Sony. According to the book Revolutionaries at Sony by Reiji Asakura, Namco engineers started meeting with PlayStation project head Ken Kutaragi as early as the summer of 1993, a year and a half before the PS1's Japanese release, and over 2 years before its international bow. After seeing a demo of what the hardware could do, a Namco engineer responded,
"This is remarkable. Very little surprises me. The only times I've been truly surprised were when the Famicom was released, when System 22 was completed, and now. Let's work together on this."
They collaborated with Sony on the Namco System 11 board, which basically was a PS1 without a disk drive. Inspired by the hardware's ability and price point, they set out to make a game to take on Sega's Virtua Fighter, which they knew could then easily be ported to the PlayStation. That game was, of course, the original Tekken. which alongside Ridge Racer and the first Ace Combat game, initially titled Air Combat in North America, would form an important part of Sony's early ads and marketing strategy. These were cutting-edge 3D games, and Ridge Racer being available at launch was a huge get for PlayStation. Sure, Capcom and Midway were there at launch too, with Street Fighter the Movie and NBA Jam Tournament Edition respectively, but those games were 2D, last generation stuff. I mean, how many Street Fighter games were on the 16-bit consoles? Maybe not this one, but a whole bunch of them were. An NBA Jam Tournament Edition? It was on everything, and I would know. But if you wanted to experience Ridge Racer at home, it had to not only be on the new generation of systems, but the PlayStation specifically.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
To say that Namco had a huge impact on early PlayStation audiences would be putting it mildly. And in March of 1997, they released into arcades what would eventually become their best-selling and most critically acclaimed PS1 game, Tekken 3. And yeah, I'm playing this on real arcade hardware. Tekken 3 is actually built on the Namco System 12 board, which clearly was an evolution of the System 11 board. Still based on PS1 hardware, this board clocks the processor about 50% faster, and swaps out the sound chip from a Mitsubishi to a Hitachi. It's also JVS compliant, which I'm not going to get in the weeds on that here, just know that it's a different way to connect to an arcade cabinet besides the standard JAMA connector. So if you're totally unawares of what the Tekken franchise is, it's a series of fighting games that primarily focuses on the Mishima family, a powerful family from Japan with a pretty bonkers history, which includes patriarch Heihachi dropping his son Kazuya into a ravine at age 5. You know, just to toughen him up a little bit. Like the most extreme version of rub some dirt on it imaginable. But don't worry, Kazuya returned the favor by dropping his dad into the same ravine later on. Heihachi survives, of course. As does Kazuya when Heihachi later drops him into an active volcano. In the background of all this family drama, a host of other characters go about their lives and enter Heihachi's King of the Iron Fist tournament with a massive purse at stake thanks to Heihachi's corporation, the Mishima Zaibatsu. Originally titled Rave War, the first Tekken game sees the player choosing one of 8 main characters or up to 10 hidden ones to win the tournament. And as I said, its port to the PS1 was huge in the early days of the system. Tekken 2 was largely more of the same, with graphical improvements and new characters, but Tekken 3 is the one most players consider the moment where the franchise truly hit its stride. Tekken 3 sees a fairly large time jump, with 19 years having passed since the events of Tekken 2. Because of this, the roster loses many members, with this being the only game in the series not to see Kazuya Mishima as a character. Instead, his son, with Tekken 2 roster member Jun Kazama, a young man named Jin Kazama, is thrust into the spotlight. Similarly, we see Martial Law's son, Forrest, and the trainees of other earlier fighters, and of course, a handful of new ones. Now, there is a whole bunch of lore going on here involving the Mishima family drama, a fighting god accidentally awoken in Mexico by a Mishima Zaibatsu excavation, and more. But let's be real, it's a fighting game. And especially in the arcade version, it's nearly impossible to assemble a coherent narrative. But the game at the heart of all this nonsense? Whew, what a game. As I said, this game is considered the point where the series truly hits its stride, and that largely stems from small but important changes to the fighting, but I'm getting ahead of myself. At its core, the Tekken series has much more in common with Virtua Fighter than Street Fighter, concerned primarily with characters practicing real fighting styles, though there are more exceptions here than in VF. In fact, this game was completely motion captured and features the movements of everyone's favorite Japanese murder grandpa, the one and only Minoru Suzuki. Yeah, not kidding. Each fighting style, from karate to taekwondo to pro wrestling, is executed with the use of 4 buttons, each one corresponding to a limb. Right punch, right kick, left kick. Pushing both left attacks or both right attacks at the same time executes a throw. And of course, combos can be strung together from a variety of button presses. This is nothing new for the third game, but what is new is a focus on using the third dimension. Well, yes, all games in the series were in 3D, they hadn't truly used the available perspective yet. Unlike Battle Arena Toshinden, not all characters in the first 2 Tekken games could dodge along the third axis. That changed with Tekken 3. Tekken 3 also fine-tuned the core gameplay, making the game move faster overall. From jumps to recovery after being knocked down, it all moves at a better clip. They've also polished the hit detection to a fine sheen, and there's nothing quite as satisfying as either just barely beating your opponent to a hit, or just barely dodging out of the way of their attack. It just feels so good. And while I would probably cite Tekken 4 as my personal favorite of the series, Tekken 3 still feels great, and I'm a little mad at myself that I hadn't revisited it in years before getting this arcade board. Tekken 3 hit arcades when I was 14 years old, and I played a ton of it. Crowds were quartering up. For my younger viewers, quartering up is where you basically form a line for whose turn it is next by putting your quarter on the bezel of the game, en masse, just to take on the next challenge. According to Japanese arcade magazine Game Machine, it was the most successful arcade game of 1997, so you can imagine the fever pitch that was rolling when the game hit the PlayStation 1. And we'll talk about it after these messages.
Milk. Pure magic.
どこまで進化するのか Tekken 3
PlayStation You left it on again, didn't you?
There are games, and then there's Tekken 3.
PlayStation.
Round 1
The PlayStation port of Tekken 3 hit Japan on March 24th, 1998, April 30th, 1998 in North America, and Europe in September of the same year. It was a huge hit both critically and commercially, and when I say huge, I mean huge. It got the first 10s from EGM since Sonic & Knuckles in 1995, and it remains the best-rated fighting game in that publication's history. And it wasn't just EGM. Everyone went bananas for Tekken 3 on PlayStation. In fact, Metacritic has it listed as the second highest-rated PS1 game of all time, behind only Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, which makes it higher rated than Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil 2, Metal Gear Solid. Yeah. Of course, what makes it so great largely is all the stuff I already talked about with the arcade version, but this one does change things up a bit. For starters, the default settings are more forgiving, since the arcade game shipped set to hard difficulty, with the player only getting 80% of the health the computer players get. Talk about cheap. But the PS1 game sets the defaults to medium with no health imbalance, and it comes with all the standard bells and whistles you see in fighting game home ports. The Versus mode, which the arcade version technically has in the operator settings as event mode, which allowed arcades to easily host tournaments, but the arcade was lacking a team battle mode and options to remap the controls. This home port adds more modes. Tekken Force, a not very well executed take on the belt-scrolling brawler genre, as well as the unlockable Tekken Ball mode, which sort of merges Tekken and Super Dodgeball. There's also a theater mode that lets you view the ending movies, themselves exclusive to this version. The arcade game just dumps you to a screen showing your time, and then gives you a highlight reel of all your wins when you beat the game, which, that's cool and not in this version, but I think I like the individual ending movies more. Theater mode will also check your memory card for Tekken 1 and 2 saves and gives you the endings you've earned in those games too, which, yeah, feels kinda silly in the YouTube era, but at the time was really cool. This version also adds a remixed soundtrack, which I'd like to say is better than the original soundtrack, but I think that has more to do with me hearing this version more in my youth than the arcade version. On the latest listen, I think they're both pretty awesome. But if you like the arcade, you can switch back to it in the options menu. This is also one of the few PS1 games to output in 480i instead of 240p. The arcade let the operator choose the display mode, believe it or not, but this higher resolution really makes the game pop on a CRT, though you can't really get a feel for it here via HD capture, as the game looks good either way. Visually, the game does suffer ever so slightly with the backgrounds, which were rendered in full 3D in the arcade game, and are now just flat textures of the 3D arcade backgrounds, which means they lose some of the little visual flares. But I'm sure what really interests you is the gameplay, and, well, yeah, gameplay-wise, this game is arcade perfect. It plays just like you would expect if you were an arcade Tekken 3 veteran, though it adds some characters. First and foremost, Anna Williams is no longer just a palette swap of her sister Nina. She gets her own character slot, ending, and extra outfits. In fact, she kinda has two endings since the Japanese version is slightly different, but more importantly than that, the PS1 game has two all-new characters. First is Gon, a little dinosaur you get after beating him in Tekken Ball mode. Gon is from a manga and was only included in the PS1 port of the game. He's a comedy character, considered bottom tier by experts, but he's still kind of fun to mess around with. That, sadly, is less true of the other exclusive character to this port, Dr. Boskanovich. He's an old man, a scientist who plays a role in a lot of that lore stuff I was talking about earlier, but he is terrible and not fun to play as. Overall, this is an amazing port, but let's do our due diligence and do like we always do, take a look and a listen side by side.
Round 1. Fight! You win. Round 2. Fight!
The visuals of the PS1 game are incredibly close to the arcade for obvious reasons, but the 3D backgrounds give the original the smallest of advantages. As for the sound, well, like I said, I think I prefer the PS1 remixed soundtrack, but both are solid, get ya pumped up fighting game soundtracks. And that makes it time to give the edge. And while the arcade version does look a little better, the PS1 version plays identically and has more characters, more modes, and just generally more bells and whistles, so this is the one that you want. And that's a great thing because it's a lot cheaper, as I'm sure you can imagine. You can get this one for $10 for a disc-only copy, and between 10 and 20 for a complete copy. So if you're a fighting game fanatic, you gotta check it out. course, that would normally be it, but this is the PlayStation Celebration, so let's talk a little more about the PS1's middle years. As the 5th best-selling game on the platform, Tekken 3 was a huge title as the PS1 entered the height of its popularity. Alongside other 1998 games like Resident Evil 2 and Metal Gear Solid, the PS1 became the must-have system for any avid game player. A lot of folks, myself included, had an N64 or Saturn as a second machine, and I love those platforms. But with games like this, there was no question. You had to have a PlayStation. And while Namco had been there since launch, they were hardly the only important third party. Capcom's Resident Evil was the system's biggest seller until Square's Final Fantasy VII blew it away to become the best-selling non-pack-in title in the system's history. Third parties propelled the PS1 to its lofty perch among game systems. Square released 0 games on either the N64 or Saturn. Namco released 0 on Saturn and a paltry 3 on the N64, including a baseball game that never hit North America, though they did license Ridge Racer to Nintendo for them to make a version of that. Even Capcom only released 3 games on the N64, though they did offer more robust support for the Saturn, but that was mostly relegated to Japan. And because of this third-party imbalance, the PS1 stayed firmly in the driver's seat. The PlayStation sold more than double what the N64 and Saturn did combined. The train could not be stopped. So for publishers, it was either get on board or get left behind. And speaking of getting on board, one of the great third parties of that era, Konami, did not forsake Nintendo and Sega in quite the same way that Square or Namco did. But they were firmly on the PS1 train. And we'll talk about that next time as we end the PlayStation Celebration with a Halloween special. See you then. Hey folks, thanks for watching. Let me start by shouting out Michael B. the Game Genie, not only for providing his lovely Newfoundland accent to read that section of Revolutionaries at Sony, but also for the B-roll footage of Quartering Up. A link to his channel is in the description. If you liked what you saw, do all the normal stuff. Like, subscribe if you haven't, share with your friends, and comment below with your favorite fighting game on the PS1. If you really liked what you saw, consider supporting directly via Patreon or YouTube channel membership. Just $1 per video gets your name here with these lovely people, early access, the chance to vote on future videos, and more. This channel is ad-free thanks to this kind of support, but also thanks to the affiliate links and merch sales in the description. If you want more PlayStation Celebration, the playlist is on the left, and if you want more videos made with a real arcade board, the WWF WrestleFest video is on the right.